Hey, welcome. I'm realizing starting with a swastika is perhaps an unusual way of doing things, but we are entering interesting territory in Social 20 here. We are going to be taking a look at the rise of Hitler and, of course, Nazi Germany. We're going to be in the interwar period, a time period between World War One and World War Two, where frankly a lot of interesting stuff happens in Spain and Italy, in Japan, even the United States and Canada. Different interesting things in all those places. To be completely clear on that, we are jettisoning all of that, just focusing on Hitler because nothing says pandemic teaching quite like going for the Nazis. We're going to be really using this as an opportunity to look at unbridled, unfiltered ultra nationalism and the pursuit or the full pursuit of national interest above all other things. You might remember that ultra nationalism is kind of like nationalism on steroids, but instead of just like being like, hey, my nation is pretty cool, I would like to promote it, ultra nationalists are fanatical. They are willing to kill and be killed, among other things, in pursuit of expanding their nation or showing and maintaining its superiority. So that's going to be really quite interesting. Just full disclosure, this isn't my PowerPoint. I've inherited it from another teacher. I've tweaked it over the years, but it is a wild ride we are about to embark on that looks at all things from baby Hitler to the death of Hitler. And this is really going to set up our genocide museum as well. All right, buckle up because this is a treat. All right, now that you are thoroughly blown out of the water, I hope you reflect on the images you've seen, but more importantly, I hope that music has inspired you to go wage world war. No? Okay. All right. Well, we are looking at Adolf Hitler today, and obviously he has an outsized influence on world history. But today we want to look at the question of really what led to his rise to power and the Nazis ruling Germany. Now, this question is kind of a combination of social 20 and 30 questions. This very theme is going to emerge again in social 30 when we look at authoritarianism, when we look at the challenges of liberal democracies. So we're going to look at that angle again next year. This year, we're going to focus more on the nationalist tendencies, if you will. The two things are essential, they're linked, but so it's impossible to separate them. But that's really where we're going to focus today, with some allusions to 30 ahead. All right, well, let's take a look at baby Hitler. He certainly looks like any other young person that's had a bowl put over his head and his hair cut accordingly. It's important to note that he is not, in fact, German, as in like Germany. He is Austrian. and that will play a part here to come as well. But otherwise, it's worth noting he looks like any other child. All right. Now, these are the parents. I just love the heading, the parents of a monster. Like, bravo, whatever teacher placed that in. Again, if we are at, say, an intro level philosophy course, we might get into the discussion of nature versus nurture. Was he born a monster? Was he always destined to be a monster? If there is such a thing as destiny, like, did his parents shape him into it? Did his environment shape him into it? Like, who knows? Anyways, there's the parents, not awesome individuals. There's a whole bunch of stories there you can dig into. Ultimately, though, he was labeled as a pretty smart kid, but as a student, didn't do well. Relatable. All of us can relate to that. His parents died when he was a teenager, which really does seem like the setup to Batman, but actually is set up to Hitler. And he did have a modest inheritance, which would ultimately dwindle quite rapidly. If you're wondering where Hitler is, there is Hitler. Um, that'll be a running theme today. But little Hitler, as the case may be, his goal, his desire was to become an artiste, an artist. And not just an artist in any sense. He really did believe that he could do any kind of art. He believed he was just so talented and so amazing that to settle on just one art to focus on would really be beneath him. Ultimately, though, he was kind of wedged in to painting. This is one of the schools, or the school that rejected him because his paintings weren't good enough. Hold that thought, we'll come back to it. But ultimately, I mean, he's moving to the city of Vienna, the capital of Austria. It's big, it's the big city compared to the countryside he grew up in. And he's experiencing the culture, good and bad, of that city. Now, I should point out that texts from prior to this, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, had revealed a deep, deep loathing and hatred of the Jewish people in Europe well before this. So when I say that Hitler is going to be exposed to anti-Semitism here, that's not anything new within the European context. All right, let's go back to that art thought here. This is the art that Hitler got rejected for. Now, note that it wasn't as blurry. These are low quality images. I mean, dude actually had some talent. So if he's not making it into art school with pieces like that, all of you are doomed trying to get into whatever university or college program. That's all I'm saying. No, that's no, not a good. Okay, never mind. All right, let's move on from that. Now, he also really did love music. You got a taste of Wagner earlier on here. A lot of this music was really stirring. It was uplifting, but also kind of angry feeling. I get mixed emotions when I listen to his music. But this was the music that Hitler grew up listening to. It glorifies Germany. There's often war as a theme to it. And so for all the people being like, hey, video games, that's what causes violence. I turn it around and say opera music causes untold violence, probably far more than video games. So, yeah. All right. Let's move on. Now, Hitler, again, is going to be in Vienna. He's going to be exposed to all sorts of different things. He's going to meet guys like von Schoenler and Luger, or at least be influenced by their politics. And he's going to hear these things, like the mayor, Luger. He says that the public would do without freedoms in exchange for security. Very Thomas Hobbes of him. again, there's a reference to Social 30 there. So he's going to get swept up in the politics of the city. He's going to get transformed by Vienna. Um, this is very much so. If I were an English teacher, I would talk about how the setting shaped the character and the narrative. That's not me though. All right. Now he is going to continue to be swept up with these things. He's going to hear of German nationalism. He's going to hear of this Aryan ideal, the blonde hair, blue eyes, all that, which he does not have. And he is really just going to be, enamored with these thoughts, with all of that thinking. Now, the Vienna Academy is going to decline him again and be like, nah, he ain't good enough. We get out of here. He's going to do like the street art stuff. He's going to do like, hey, come get a drawing, come get a sketch. He also does a lot of like cheap knockoffs of famous paintings, that kind of thing, which is pretty rad, I guess, if that's how you want to make your living by doing knockoffs. It reminds me of there's a character named Red in Animal Crossing that sells you fake paintings. Hitler, Red, I don't know. Anyways, he ultimately will be homeless, which is, yeah, not great. There, though, there was, kind of a draft, if you will, in Austria-Hungary. When you turn 20, you're supposed to join the military. He chose not to. It wasn't that he didn't want to go to war, as we would see later on, but he really didn't like the Austrian monarchy. And his big thing was this multi-ethnic army. There were Jews, there were Czechs, there were Poles, there were Slovaks, Hungarians, and all number of groups that he called inferior. He wanted to only be surrounded by the superior Aryans in his thinking. So he did what any Aryan would do. He joins the German army. There, I hope you all know what the image on the left is. Princip Ferdinand sparking World War One. All right, moving on. There's Hitler. Just as an aside, I have to bring this up every year. Can you imagine being a historian whose job it was to comb through pictures of German citizens to be like, oh, there's Hitler. There he is. Found him. It would be like the worst version of Where's Waldo ever. Anyways, moving off of that thought. Oh, look, there's Hitler again. Uh, it was a thing. Someone has to do the job. Someone got paid money to be like, there he is. Hitler in World War One was a messenger. He'd go back and forth from HQ to the trenches by bicycle or on foot. This is a fairly dangerous job. You ever heard the saying, don't shoot the messenger? There's a reason they got shot a lot. He was in the line of fire constantly, wounded twice in 1 week, sent to Germany to recover, awarded medals for bravery, including the Iron Cross. That's that little guy right there. And then he even returned to wartime service in 1917 to keep fighting. However, there was this little thing, Treaty of Versailles, you may have heard of and or negotiated it, that had huge amounts of war debts or reparations to pay billions upon billions of dollars that ballooned with time and interest and everything. Germany was humiliated. And they thought they were singled out unfairly as the only power to start World War One. Serbia gets off the hook completely. Now, this is worth just pausing and talking about the Treaty of Versailles for a moment longer, because we didn't get to debrief in the same way we would in class. At the time, after World War One, Germany had very briefly a democratic governor called the Weimar Republic. This democratic country, it was obviously short-lived, but basically no one wanted to sign the Treaty of Versailles on Germany's behalf, being like, yeah, we did this, we'll pay the money. They just kept going down the ranks until they find someone willing to sign the treaty on Germany's behalf. And so this Weimar Republic is really resented by the German people. And because this is their first and only real attempt at democracy in the country, democracy is not going to be seen as really awesome. The other thing to remember is prior to all of this, Bismarck, he actually has things like pensions for like war veterans and things like that, and that's all going to be shifted under this new regime pre-Hitler. So there's going to be a lot of pent-up resentment, a lot of quote unquote conservatism wanting to go back to times of the past. All right, let's move off of that. Hitler is an angry young man, in the words of the band Styx. He never forgot the humiliation that Germany was served at the hands of the Allies, and he really felt like Germany was being punished. Okay, keep in mind, 100 years before, when Napoleon was out gallivanting about the world, the traveling salesman of nationalism, the world came together and actively tried not to punish France. That is an important distinction. 1815, right? We're like, France, they're being silly. 100 years later, Germany, I mean, we can say outright, did not start World War One. They were dragged into it like much of the rest of Europe, and yet now they have all the blame. They have the punishment. This is outrage that was shared by many German citizens and soldiers alike. Now, Hitler's life is going to take a turn, or he's going to at least frame it looking back, because he suffered from a poison gas attack in Ypres. And this quote is quite interesting. The burning in my eyes could not match the hate burning in my heart. From that moment, I knew I should enter politics. If that's not a damning critique of politicians everywhere, I don't know what is. All right, that's an aside. This idea that he is so like that he should enter politics, though, is vitally important both for this year and next. All right, let's move on. Anti-communist poster. Communism is a snake, apparently. Germans were disillusioned. They hated the democratic government, as I already mentioned. And they also felt like they'd been stabbed in the back and they needed someone to blame. So the scapegoats du jour were the Jews and communists. So they had been defeated at home and on the battlefield. Now, extremist groups are going to start emerging, and they are going to, quote unquote, restore Germany's glory. Any modern day comparison? Oh, all right. Moving off of that. Hitler did still stay in the army. He was hired as a spy. He was, planted in various groups as a way of seeing if they were like secret communists. Yeah, it's also kind of weird. But ultimately, he continued to learn about this idea of the master race, the Aryan supremacy, all of that stuff. And he also came into this non-knowledge that the Jews had this like global conspiracy to control the world. That conspiracy lingers to this day and has existed for hundreds upon hundreds of years. Ultimately, Hitler is going to find that he is a gifted public speaker. We'll talk about that a little more later on. Normally, we would watch quite a bit of one of his speeches, and we talked about the techniques he uses. I mean, obviously, it's in German, so we're not going to necessarily understand it. But you'll find that he's very good at pulling you in, even if you're like, don't know a word you're saying, but I'm angry with you, Adolf. He's a very powerful public speaker. And he does it in such a way that the audience was just mesmerized, transfixed, whatever you want to say. Anyways, he gets placed in the German Workers' Party. They were anti-Bolshevik, which means anti-communist, as well as anti-Semitic, which means anti-Jew. He actually agreed with their views, so he became a member, number 55, in fact. Ultimately, becoming the party leader of the NSDAP. So as he becomes the leader of the NSDAP, people just take that. They're like, that's a lot of words there. Let's just call that Nazi. And of course, there is the swastika, very, very famous. You may have seen a swastika or two in this PowerPoint, or more. Let's be honest about that. It's really worth noting that the swastika has been around for thousands upon thousands of years, and for the vast majority of those thousands of years, was not associated with the violent genocide of the Jewish people. In fact, it represented life and good luck. I had a jewelry purchaser. I tell this story every year. A number of years ago, when she was in Southeast Asia, brought back jewelry for us to sell in our shop, and the one section of it was just decked with swastikas. And I'm like, you freaking kidding me? And she's like, oh, but this is a symbol of peace and good luck. I'm like, yeah, I know that. I teach history. I still can't sell swastikas in a store in Canada. It's not going to happen. Hitler managed to completely erase 3,000 years of history. Anyways, they when they were looking at the swastika, they really wanted an image that had been around for thousands of years to make it seem like they were part of something larger, part of something that had lasted forever. And so that's why they preempted this image. Now, it also, I mean, was posted, the swastika on its own, right, is one thing, but you put that black swastika on the white background surrounded in a field of red, and it's very eye-catching, right? I mean, even right now, and I'm looking at my screen reading this to you, my eye is continually drawn to the center of the swastika, right? The red, white, black in that order just pulls you in. So it's really a powerful propaganda tool as much as anything else. Now, it's worth taking a look to see that swastikas have been used in many, many traditions around the world, transcends cultures. In fact, and a lot of students will point this out, the Jewish people have their own swastika symbol. And yes, I appreciate that the Celtic swastika looks like a dude with three legs coming out of his head. Um, just take your moment to appreciate it, and your moment is past. You'll also notice that this Hindu symbol seems to pair kind of a Star of David type thing with the swastika, which is ironic in the not funny way for many reasons as well. So swastikas have been universal symbols, and it's amazing how, one tiny period of time, in terms of the scope of human history, has completely erased our understanding of these symbols. Moving on. Hitler ultimately is like, hey, we should get rid of this democratic government. We're going to have a putsch, a takeover, and they're going to march into this beer hall where a political meeting was taking place. The Bavarian police have been tipped off, so they start shooting. 18 Nazis are killed, most of the others arrested, and Hitler winds up on trial. Now, it is a bit goofy because the judge is like, hey, I like this guy. So the judge gives Hitler basically an unfettered platform to just go on and express his political views. And Hitler becomes like a pseudo celebrity because of this. Uh, Hitler says there's no such thing as treason against the traitors of 1918. If it wasn't clear before, Hitler does not like the Treaty of Versailles one bit. All right. So Hitler gets like the lightest of light sentences in a minimum security prison. He writes his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And in there, you can actually read this book now. It entered the public domain a few years ago. I want to say 3 years ago. He talks about Lebensraum, a living space. This idea that Germany must take over other countries, and particularly Russia, where there's a lot of Jews and a lot of communists, for the use of the master race. As well, he wants to eradicate inferior races, especially the Jews, destroying them completely. If that language of eradication sounds like we're talking about pests, like rats or bugs or something like that, I really want you to hold that thought and that feeling, because that language is very intentional. So Hitler, after all of this, has a revelation. The light bulb goes off on his head, and he says, "We need to attain power through legal means, not violent overthrow." So his new approach is ballots, not bullets. Let's get votes. Now, the Great Depression has set into the United States. We'll talk about how this ripples from the United States to Germany in Social 30, when we're looking at both the economics and political units. But suffice to say that the States was effectively bailing Germany out through much of this time period. They're paying reparations. And the gravy train comes to a screeching halt with the Great Depression settling in. And so Germany becomes not awesome. Now, we need to be very, very, very careful when we look at an image like this. Correlation does not equal causation. So these are two things that are mapped on the same graph that are very likely tied together, but not necessarily. Normally, here we would stop and we'd look at graphs of like the number of Nicolas Cage movies released in a year corresponding to the number of shark attacks. Turns out those two graphs line up awfully close. So just because two things are on a graph together doesn't mean necessarily they're connected. Now, I do want to point out that this probably is connected because we know when times are bad, people turn to extremes for answers. Look at the French Revolution, right? Number of violent attacks on the aristocracy as, the price of bread went up, directly connected. So here we see the unemployment rate, it is going up very aggressively, hitting that 30% threshold. And by the early 1930s, the NSDAP are going to get, a third of the vote share. So this is, again, more of a Social 30 focus. We won't linger on this too long. But if we take a look at 1920 to kind of 1933, you'll notice the color change difference here. The Nazis aren't even a thing, right off the hop there. You don't see them at all. They start emerging, tiny number in 1928, a larger number by 1930, 32, they're kind of, and by March 3rd, 1933, 33, they get 33.3% of the vote. And then they'll use that to legally give themselves total control later on in the year. That's kind of the short version. The Reichstag, by the way, is their parliament. Hitler then will become chancellor. This is a separated system at the time, so there is both a prime minister and a president. So the president is von Hindenburg. Hitler then is like kind of the prime minister, the chancellor in this case. Hitler is ultimately, he's got a third of the vote. Hindenburg wants to contain Hitler's rise, and so he offers him that position in government. Now, Hitler is aspirational, if nothing else. So when Hindenburg dies of natural causes, we hope, Hitler's like, I'll just be the president too. So he takes all the power. He takes the very separate power of the president and the chancellor and merges them, creating this new position called Der Führer, or the leader. All right. So as they go, He is going to further cement his power using violence where necessary to become a totalitarian state. Now, there's also going to be an opportunity for him as well. You see, the Reichstag is going to be set ablaze, and he is going to blame the communists for this. And in doing so, he will ban them and all political parties from the Reichstag or parliament. Now, it is worth noting that people aren't entirely clear that, this guy, van der Lubbe, actually set the building on fire. It may well be that Hitler had one of his Nazis do it. We aren't entirely sure. Regardless, Hitler will ban unions and political parties, and now he is the state. He is what, Louis the 14th always wanted to be. Now, Hitler is also going to be going after potential rival Nazis. There's something called the Night of the Long Knives, and this language is also important. It's been stolen and used for other cases of quote unquote betrayal. Canada has its own Night of the Long Knives that is far less violent. But ultimately, Hitler will kill roughly 1,000 Nazis that he sees as threats against him. And he is going to establish himself as the Third Reich, the Third Holy Roman Empire. And he says it'll be 1,000-year Reich. It'll be so successful that the empire that he establishes will last for 1,000 years. Cool. And now, book burning, lovely. Book burnings, anything that was un-German was burned. And of course, we have this quote from like 100+ years before. They that start by burning books will end by burning men. How true Heinrich Heine turned out to be about someone from his own country, in fact. Now, Hitler, as der Führer, his personal views were tied in with everything. But one of the big things that he believed in was social Darwinism. Those of you that are in bio will know that Darwin is the guy that's like, hey, evolution through species. He's looking at, the finches and looking at how they adapted because of their various beaks, and the strong will survive, kind of genetically. Well, Hitler is going to take that, and he is actually going to be like, hey, we are the superior race, and it's science that says so. Science doesn't say so, but he's going to twist Darwin's thoughts, and this is what social Darwinism. Now, eugenics is going to come into play here, an idea that he adopts from a little place you may have heard of called Alberta. In Alberta, we actually used to sterilize, make it so people could reproduce if they had certain cognitive disabilities, so impairment. And Hitler is going to be like, hey, that's good thinking. Good job. Cool. All right. Now, indoctrination is absolutely vital to Hitler's success. You couldn't be a teacher unless you joined the Nazi Teachers Association. You'd be fired if you weren't. The curriculum was all about Nazi beliefs. So, like geography and history would teach about how the communists and Jews were conspiring against the Aryan races. They talk about like Lebensraum, like the geography would be like, what land should we take over next? That'd be like a math problem. If we have this land and the Russians have that much land, how much land is rightfully ours? Answer all of it. And then the biology science courses really taught that pseudoscience of racial superiority, that social Darwinism. They really fixated on that. So everywhere you went from a school standpoint, you were, completely caught up in that. There were youth clubs as well. and no shortage of children's books. Normally, we would actually read this story and a couple of others after like several warnings that these aren't my beliefs. There's a copy of this book actually at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg as well. So if you ever go there, their kind of Holocaust exhibit is incredible to experience. But yeah, ultimately, this mother compares for her child that the Jew is the most poisonous mushroom in existence. Okay. Again, as I mentioned, Hitler's speeches are, he essentially makes a science out of getting people into a frenzy. He starts flailing his arms later on, but they always start very calmly. They're always very quiet, very muted. And what he wants is he wants you to be kind of hanging on to every word. You have to listen intently, and then they're gonna get a little bit louder, and he's gonna look for this hook. He's gonna look for that guy that's like into it. He's gonna like, yeah, that's the guy, and he's gonna start amping it up. The arms are gonna get a little more flaily. The spit is going to start coming out, the words enunciated that much more clearly. And ultimately, he's going to be just throwing his arms around. He's going to be like screaming to the audience. It would be enraged. By the time he was done, it looked like he'd just run a marathon. He'd be drenched in sweat. And people loved this, at least they appeared to love it. If nothing else, they would, they'd start cheering Sieg Heil, or Hail Victory. You see that German salute. And they just like, they'd roar.
Wenn es den internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Folge noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis das nicht des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Dude was angry. I mean, that was one selected part of a speech. If you get to experience the whole speech as much as possible where they exist online, you'll see the whole pattern. That is, kind of the beginning of the crescendo, to use a music term, right? Where he begins the fiery accusations, he begins the enunciations, and the crowd, they're into it. So that's one of his most utilized techniques, and he's borrowing, even some of the imagery from kind of churches, the voices, the chanting, the singing, the cymbals, all of that. He's like, yeah, good job, church. This is powerful stuff. It works with people. I'm going to use that for me. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader. He wanted people to reiterate that, made for good, effective propaganda. And, here's Hitler, the knight in shining armor. He is the ideal as much as he can be. Look at that eagle. Look at the sun breaking through. I mean, if I replace this with, random other Canadian flags and insert prime minister of choice and, I don't know, a beaver flying majestically above. Beavers don't fly, I don't know. But you can imagine if I adapted this image, I got rid of the Nazi iconography. You could imagine being like, yeah, that's very inspiring. Like, I feel closer to my Canadian leader. And so the art was weaponized and deployed very much so in Hitler's favor. We see it constantly. The images are repeated. Notice the similarity with the soldier image to this one. It's not as great because the guy's not as great as Hitler, but the image is going to mirror it as well. Ah, yes, nothing says track and field day like bringing our picture of Hitler with us to celebrate. The Hitler youth being indoctrinated is something else. But Hitler had these massive rallies and parades. He actually learned this from Benito Mussolini, who normally we would have talked about by now, but we're not this year. And again, you see these incredible images that if you get rid of the Nazi iconography, you're like, oh, that's really cool. And look, like that's like a Garth Brooks concert out there. These are people funneled in to watch, to listen, to be whipped up into a frenzy. To the point that at events like the Olympics, they're making these displays of giant swastikas. No, and there's propaganda everywhere. Look at the enemy, Britain, the States, and the Soviet Union, behind the enemy powers, the Jew. No. Ultimately, concentration camps were set up to enslave and exterminate the thousands upon thousands of undesirables, especially the Jews. Albright macht frei, work will set you free. Just as a random aside, in all of this like lockdown, not lockdown, coronavirus, COVID stuff in the United States, there was this like group of protesters that had this written in German as part of their anti-lockdown messaging, and I found that really interesting and also disgusting because it's like the work will set you free means they work you until they choose to kill you. And the fact that people chose to leave it in German really makes me just question their value in human life or just their general knowledge of history. I don't know. But yeah, work will set you free or work sets you free is not an inspiring message. It is a bold faced lie. All right, moving off of that. The reality is that you would not be set free, you would be exterminated. And I really want you to hold on to that language because, Hitler is labeling the mentally ill, the communists, the gypsies, homosexuals, people with physical disabilities as a subspecies of the human race. Effectively saying, like, you're cockroaches that deserve extermination. Great. And the other thing that Hitler did really well is he understood that if people saw that this was happening, that they would be revolted. So they purged as much evidence as possible. And I should point out these are not going to be awesome images. So if you need to look away or caution, I really do encourage you to do so. Censored image, of course. There were all sorts of experiments. The Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele, was experimenting on all sorts of things. He was particularly fascinated with like twins and stuff like that. Some people will point out that some of the medical advancements of the Nazis are still used today. Great, I guess. Thanks, Nazis, is what they're trying to get me to say. I'm not in the mood ever to thank Nazis, so I'm not going to. But they also have this like weird fascination with the belief that there might be like psychic connections between twins. So that was researched as well. Gold and silver teeth were extracted and collected and then melted down for profit. So that's really great. And ultimately, that genocide is going to end with Hitler's death. We don't get into how he died, etc. There's stories about his dogs, there's stories about his on again, off again, maybe girlfriend in here. But ultimately, when it's inevitable that the jig is up, Hitler is going to kill himself and things are going to end kind of there. It won't go well for him. And what that will lead to is a discovery, actually, of the atrocities committed. The Americans and others are going to round up the Germans and take them to the camps and be like, this is what was happening in your backyard. And many of the German people are going to be shocked as well. So that was your taste of the rise of Hitler. Here are many of the people that contributed to the original PowerPoint. Hey, next day we are going to begin your Genocide Museum project. So be ready for that.